Hi, thank you for joining me for my artist talk about my show Storylines here at Oric Gallery. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came up with the idea of Storylines and then talk a little bit about a couple pieces in the show so you can see my process. Storylines came about from my fascination with how our personal stories evolve over time and how everything builds on it, what came before, like all the people we know, all of the places we visited, all of our experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything along the way, all of those experiences keep adding up to who we become today. And so that felt to me like it was a correlation with how I work, how I create my art, bits and pieces, and building on what comes before and adding all those layers. It felt very much like the same sort of process as how we become who we are. That's how my art is. It becomes who it is along the way. And that just, to me, just really, really kind of struck home to me about how there's this correlation between life and art. And I wanted to explore that a little bit with this show. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different paintings so you can see where I started and where I ended up. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this one over here, this painting called Homesick. And this started with a nice, lovely landscape painting, right? I mean, I work with so many layers that most of mine start with landscapes, to be honest, because I have this kind of interest in landscapes, but I want it to be more than just a basic landscape. So this is started with, a lovely blue sky and some trees and a lake, and it was very pastoral, right? Very peaceful and lovely, but it wasn't really what I wanted it to be. It wasn't finished. It didn't feel finished to me. So I just kept adding layers, and I added some color and I scraped some color back and scribbled into it, and I just kept changing it, and each layer kind of reminded me of this was a piece about longing, a piece about wanting to revisit places we visited before or places we've lived, and that nostalgia that comes with being homesick. And so that's where this piece came from. It started with just a simple landscape of a lovely place that may or may not exist somewhere in time, but it evolved into something about longing for um, a different place, a different time, and that homesickness. So that's where that one kind of came from and how it evolved. So let's see here. Um, this one down here, which is called Best Friends, this one also evolved from trees. Okay, I have a thing with trees, so very often a lot of my pieces start with trees or branches or leaves or something like that. So this one also started with some branches kind of intertwined together and kind of linked together. And that, as I started adding more layers over those branches, because I know they're just a base layer, I'm never going to finish with what I start with. That's just a base layer. But I added more color and more lines and lots of texture. And I started to think about how the starting point was trees kind of linked together and how they were touching and supporting each other. And that kind of reminded me of friendship and how we are intertwined with our friends and we are part of them even though we're separate. And that is how I came up with the Best Friends title for this one. There's no trees left, But the trees are under there, and those trees inform the final story. And so that's how that one came about. This one, which is called Someone to Love, this one, I know it doesn't look like love, because love generally, associate love with a lot of pinks and reds, and this doesn't really have that. But it came about because it started with something really, really dark. Okay, the starting point had a lot of black, a lot of dark blue, dark orange, and it was very textural and very heavy. And I didn't like that. I didn't like the heaviness of it. So I sanded a bunch of it down and started adding some lighter colors, some blues and greens and whites, and lightened it up. And as I was doing that, I kind of felt like, oh, there's a lightness here and there's an openness now that wasn't there before. And to me, that kind of implied this feeling of love, that you have to be open to love. You have to be open to the lightness of being in love. And even though it's not got hearts on it or has pinks or reds, it still to me reminded me that you have to be open to love in order to experience it. So that's where that piece came from. All of these pieces have similar kind of stories, and the titles are a moment in time, in a moment in what is the story of our life. And they should respond to most people, like Tell Me a Secret and First Date and um, Nothing Lasts Forever. All of those titles are just titles that are moments in time in our lives. And even though the titles speak to me, they might not speak to you. I always have this conflict about titling my art because I want the viewer to experience the art as they see it, not as I see it, because just because that speaks to me for that particular reason doesn't mean it will speak to you that way. But I also know that a lot of people like to see the titles, and that gives them insight into maybe what was intended. It's kind of like this ambivalent thing for me about whether I title things or not. But hopefully you can come out and see the show and get some insight into maybe how I was working, but also have some experience yourself in viewing it in person. For me, I know viewing things in person is way different than seeing photos or watching this video. You can't really see and experience the art the same way if you don't see it in person. And so I always encourage people to go visit galleries, go out and look at museums, and go to open houses, that kind of thing, where artists showcase their work, because that's such a different experience if you see things in person. I remember the first time I saw a Rothko painting. I had never really been a huge fan of Rothko. It was sort of like ambivalent towards him. But I was visiting Chicago with a friend, and we went to the Chicago Art Institute, and they have several Rothkos there. And going into that gallery and seeing that work in person was just mesmerizing. The scale of the work and the layers. I mean, talk about layers. I work in layers, but that's a lot of layers that Rothko uses. And the depth of the piece, the emotional response that happens when you see something like that that's so sublime that you just are astonished by the viewing of it. And whenever I think of that, that reminds me I need to go look at art galleries in person. I need to go see what the artist is trying to say in person. And whenever I travel, I definitely look at museums and art galleries to see what's out there. And it's such a different experience if you look in person. than if you see a picture online. So I hope you come out and see my show in person, as well as the other artists in the gallery. And I really want to say thank you to Abby and to Gundy for having such a fabulous space that they provide for local artists, and how beautifully they showcase the work every month. And come out and see the show and see how the space looks and experience art in person. And thank you for listening.